Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we read from Leviticus 15. This is another one of those chapters that 21st century American parents are just going to find awkward to read with their children. Again, my encouragement to you in those situations, read the text, read God's Word to your kids, and just see what questions they ask you, right? Let them lead the conversation. If you're not sure if they're ready for something or not, they'll tell you. Right? They'll bring the questions about, and then you can describe it briefly. And if they're curious to learn more, you can have a deeper conversation. Otherwise, you just kind of go and you move on. So here's our text for today. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this is the law of his uncleanness for a discharge. Whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is blocked up by his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Every bed on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. And anyone who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And whoever sits on anything on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches the body of the one with the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And if the one with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And any saddle on which the one with the discharge rides shall be unclean. And whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries such things shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Anyone whom the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And an earthenware vessel that the one with the discharge touches shall be broken, and every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water. And when the one with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, and wash his clothes. And he shall bathe his body in fresh water, and shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and come before Yahweh to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. And the priest shall use them, one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him before Yahweh for his discharge. If a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and be unclean until the evening. And every garment and every skin on which the semen comes shall be washed with water and be unclean until the evening. If a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them shall bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. And if any man lies with her, and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her menstrual impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge, shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and bring them to the priest, to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the priest shall use one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her before Yahweh for her unclean discharge. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. This is the law for him who has a discharge, and for him who has an emission of semen, becoming unclean thereby. Also for her who is unwell with her menstrual impurity, that is, for anyone, male or female, who has a discharge, and for the man who lies with a woman who is unclean. This is the word of the Lord. So today's text is about things that come out of your body that don't normally come out of your body, and how that makes you unclean. And really, that might be the way that you start off the text and conversation with your children about a text like this. Ask them for examples. What might come out of your body that shouldn't come out of your body? And spit would be an example of that, perhaps, that they might come up with. And spit is mentioned in the chapter, right in verse 8. As odd as that verse is. Then you could also have them mention something like when they get sick and they throw up. That would be another example of something along these lines. So these are things to consider. If you've got a medical background, you've probably seen a few other things that you could talk about as well. Now, note that the things that are more related to reproduction, the sexual side of humanity here, those are distinguished differently in the paragraphs that start at verse 16 and onward. So this first two sections are talking about general discharges that are not related to sex. And again, we gave you a couple of examples perhaps there already. These things are going to be signs of sickness, most likely. And so talking about uncleanness here, we might connect that to God is rendering these things unclean. He's calling these people unclean in order to provide better health for his people. That's a possibility, but we're going to see when we get to the end of the text, verse 31 in particular, there's more to it than just the health of the people. So hold on to that thought. But, we see it here at first. So if you've had some kind of an abnormal discharge from the body, you are unclean, right? You remain unclean, and assuming that your discharge cleans up, goes away, doesn't continue, you remain unclean for 7 days, and then you are, at that point, clean. You wash your clothes, and on the 8th day, after taking a bath, you're going to offer up that sacrifice, turtle dove and pigeon, either or, two of them. One is a sin offering, the other is a burnt offering. We've seen similar already in the book of Leviticus for other things. And so, in the meantime, though, it's what happens with that uncleanness. So, everything basically that you touch when you're unclean becomes unclean. Uncleanness primarily is going to remove you from the presence of God. As an unclean person, you cannot enter the tabernacle. So if you're a priest, that's not good. As an unclean person, you cannot enter the tent of meeting, the courtyard around the tabernacle. That also limits your ability to bring sacrifices before the Lord. So not good, right? The desire to avoid uncleanness is important, and especially when you get around certain times of year, like the Passover celebration, as you might think of a week-long festival. Imagine it this way in today's culture. If you're unclean, you can't go to church, right? So that's the big draw here. You don't want to be unclean because you want to go to the Lord's house. Think about Christmas and Easter. That would be our equivalent to them celebrating something like the Passover. High festival season, you're going to enjoy going to church, like a candlelight service or the Easter sunrise, those really special high services of the year, and you miss them because you're unclean. People are going to avoid uncleanness most of the time. And so anything he touches, and that's what you see from verses 4 and onward, a bed that he laid on, a chair that he sat on, anything like that. And if you touch one of those things that someone else who was unclean touched, now you're unclean until the evening. So you didn't have the discharge, so you're not unclean for the week or more. You're just unclean until the evening, at which point you are going to be clean. So the start of the new day, really, as they viewed it. Evening is the start of the day. So we see that going down. Verse 8 I mentioned is a little odd if the guy spits on you. So if someone's unclean because of a discharge and then he goes around spitting on people, we look at that and kind of cringe to begin with. Men should not spit on other men. That's a huge sign of disrespect. But anyway, that's here. A saddle, so another thing that can be sat on if you're riding an animal. Whoever touches any of these things, whoever carries any of these things, becomes unclean until the evening and must follow that same pattern of washing himself, washing his clothes, and he's unclean until evening. Now, earthenware vessels that the discharged one touches are broken. I was thinking maybe that has to do with the porousness. If you think of the difference between a clay pot and a metal bowl, for example. But then you get the wood is mentioned here too, and wood's pretty porous. So porousness might not be the only thing here, but perhaps the availability of such things. So earthenware is porous, but it's also, it's clay, and clay is all around them. They can make more. Whereas wood comes from trees. Trees are common at least, but perhaps not as simple to come by as the clay is. Just some thoughts on that for you. And note that this can go either way. The start of chapter 15 is male or female. It does say man, but if a woman has an abnormal discharge, this applies to the same things for her as well. So we already talked about the cleansing of that person. Now let's get down to the reproductive side of this. So now we've got distinguished between male and female, and verses 16 through 18 are for the male. And honestly, you probably aren't noticing a difference here unless you're really looking close. Verse 16, if a man has an emission of semen, and then verse 18, if a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen. So the first clause of this is outside of sex. Outside of sex within marriage, perhaps, would be a way to phrase it even. This is the man who has, while he's sleeping, has an emission. Or the man who, masturbation would be another problem here. And masturbation would be labeled a sin because it takes and cheapens God's gift of sex to marriage. Now, again, this is then in addition to the actual act of sex between man and woman. So his emission is a discharge, so it renders him unclean, but it's not the same uncleanness as the other types. This is an uncleanness that is going to be more normal, more natural, so it is not followed up by one of those sacrifices. It's not even followed up by the 7-day period that he must be considered unclean. This is just an unclean until the evening thing, because sex is a good gift from God for the purpose of furthering his creation. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. That's a part of this. So that's why this is going to be different than the normal discharges that were mentioned above. Now, it is also possible that when you combine these two ideas, male and female here, it serves to limit the idea of prostitution. Again, Israel does not want to be unclean so that they can come to the Lord for worship. These other pagan religions in their area have what's called temple prostitution going on, where basically if the local temple, not one of Yahweh's temple, but a false pagan temple, they'll have prostitutes basically that are on staff. They live there, and you come to them, you have sex with them in order that the gods would see that, and it would spur them on to the idea of fertility, and they would bless the earth, they'd bless your crops, and they'd rain down the blessings from above. That's the picture of a lot of pagan religion in the ancient Near East. And this uncleanness idea might help serve to limit that. Now, for the man, again, with this emission, his garment's unclean. Anything basically the semen touches is unclean, has to be washed, and is unclean until the evening. And that includes if it gets on, it includes the woman. She would be unclean until the evening. Now, looking at the female side here, the woman's side of things, if she has a discharge, menstrual impurity, so we would call that the period or the time of the month, those sorts of phrases used today in our culture, that would render her, unclean for 7 days, because it lasts for longer than just a moment compared to the man's. Anything she touches, or anyone she touches, is unclean until the evening. Whoever touches her bed, whoever touches whatever she sat on, same kind of things we'd seen in the earlier part of the chapter. If a man lies with her, so if she has sex with her husband, for example, that's going to make him unclean for 7 days as well. And that includes whatever bed he lies in at that point too. So they're going to be cautious around these things again. Now, it continues, though, for her. Notice again, just like with the man, that there is no offering at the end of that. There's not an additional 7 days after her bleeding has stopped. That's not a part of this, because this is a normal part of the way God designed his creation to work. These 2 paragraphs are not sickness. These are not dangerous in that sort of a sense as some of the other things might be. But if hers continues, verse 25, beyond the normal amount of time or outside that amount of time, she's unclean until it stops. And then she has to wait 7 days. And on the 8th day, just like the man in the first paragraph, in the second paragraph up above, 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one's a sin offering, one's a burnt offering. The priest makes atonement for her to cleanse her from whatever her discharge had been. Now, one of the New Testament accounts that this might bring to mind and shed some light on would be the account of Mark 5, Jesus healing that woman that had been with the discharge of blood for 12 years. Right? She had gone to doctors, she had spent all she had, no help. Actually, things had gotten worse. Consider that in this context now. Consider her uncleanness in that time and in that culture. She's been unclean continuously for 12 years. She hasn't been able to go to the Lord's house. She hasn't been able to present a sacrifice for 12 years. She has had all the people in her community around her concerned to come near her, concerned to touch her, especially as he got close to the Sabbath day, because, again, worship. For 12 years. It's not just a physical ailment that she's wrestling with at that point, right? It's more than that. It's a communal thing. It's part of the society, even her family. There is a social element to her ailment too. And Jesus heals her, and he makes her part of a family again. And he invites her not back into just her earthly family. He invites her into his own family, to be his sister, to be co-heir with him in paradise. All right, so I mentioned we'd come to verse 31. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. Chapter 10, verse 10 told us the point of the priest here is to distinguish between clean and unclean. They are to teach the people these things, lest they die. Contrast this to Nadab and Abihu, the 2 sons of Aaron who died back in chapter 10 because they came before the Lord and offered him a sacrifice he did not tell them to offer. The Lord is holy. And so we learn here in this verse that these uncleanness laws, although some of it has to do with health, there's benefit to following this. Like we could even talk about sexually transmitted diseases with a chapter like this, that God is protecting his people from such things. But it's not just about health. It's about holiness before God. To be unclean and to come before the Lord brings death. And so the Lord is protecting these people. They are learning that they are unclean. They are learning when they're unclean so that they learn when to not come into God's presence. Now, where that connects for us today is the idea that we are clean. We have been washed clean in the blood of the Lamb. All of our sins have been taken away from us, and we get to be in Christ's presence forevermore. Each and every day for the rest of forever. And this is a gift. But it's helpful to see and know some of the background of these things and just the desperation that our sin can bring.
Praise